The first question arrived before Joel Mercer had even set down his coffee. He caught himself. Wrong name. That one was taken. Let me write this properly now. The first smirk came before Brendan Solís had even finished writing down his daughter's emergency contact number. He noticed it the way he noticed most things. Not immediately, but completely. A flicker at the edge of the registration table, where a man built like a refrigerator leaned toward the colleague beside him and said something that required no volume to carry. The shoulders shook. The colleague looked over. Brendan kept writing. The paper in front of him had a small drawing in the top corner, a dog with 3 legs and a crown. His daughter Thea had added it that morning while he was packing his bag, dragging her purple marker across the form before he could stop her. He had almost reprinted it, then decided it didn't matter. The form asked for qualifications, not aesthetics. He clicked the pen closed and slid the registration sheet across the desk. 42 years old. Former RCMP plainclothes. 7 years of protective detail across 3 provinces, 2 of them assigned to Crown prosecutors under active threat assessment. 1 year embedded with a federal task force whose name he still could not say in public. Then Thea's mother left, and Brendan left the job because someone needed to be home before 6, and it stopped being her. That was 3 years ago. 3 years of contract driving, 2 part-time security stints at a mall in Mississauga, and 1 afternoon a week helping coach as a girls' soccer team, which Thea had joined only because she liked the orange slices at halftime. He was wearing his best jacket. It was not impressive. The cuffs were slightly frayed at the left wrist where Thea had chewed it absent-mindedly during a long drive 6 months ago, and there was a faded watermark near the second button that dry cleaning had never fully erased. He had ironed it that morning, which counted for something. The room was full of men who had never needed to iron anything in their lives because they simply looked correct at all times. Private contractors. Former military, the kind who mentioned it within 4 sentences of meeting anyone. 2 who Brendan recognized from competitive circuit protection work, the type of resume that arrived pre-polished, already formatted for exactly this kind of room. Hartwell Consulting Group held its executive protection trials twice a year inside a leased facility in downtown Toronto, 19th floor, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the lake. The company managed security contracts for 11 of Canada's top 20 private equity firms, 3 federal-adjacent advisory groups, and 1 very discreet client list that their website described only as high-value personal safety arrangements. They were, in a quiet and expensive way, exactly the kind of firm that Brendan had spent 3 years telling himself he did not need to be working for. Then the anonymous envelope arrived. He had almost thrown it away. No return address, no letterhead. Inside, 1 index card in clean handwriting, Hartwell Trials, Thursday, 10:15. Ask for the final slot. No signature, no explanation. Thea had found it on the kitchen counter and said it looked like an adventure. The way only 9-year-olds could make that word sound like a reasonable life strategy. He came. Now he stood in a room with 23 other applicants, most of whom had stopped looking at him after the initial assessment and returned to looking at each other, which was its own kind of dismissal. The exception was a man named Knox Alderton. Brendan learned the name from the board at the front of the room where applicants had been listed in order of their registration times. Knox Alderton was first on the list. He was also, Brendan estimated, somewhere between 6'3" and a structural support beam, with the kind of physicality that suggested he had once been compensated specifically for how he looked walking into a room. Former competitive fighter, maybe. The compression jacket left no ambiguity about the intention. He stood with his arms folded, watching Brendan finish at the registration desk with the particular smile of someone who found the situation entertaining in a way he expected everyone else to agree with. Independent contractor? Knox said, reading the board where Brendan's listed affiliation had been marked simply as self-employed. What's the specialty? Parallel parking? A few people laughed. Someone near the water station added something Brendan didn't quite catch, but the tone was clear enough. Brendan looked at Knox once, just once, and briefly, in the way he had learned to look at situations rather than people, cataloging rather than reacting. Knox favored his left side slightly when he stood at ease. Old injury compensated for so long it had become posture. He stood close to the north wall, which put him nearest to both the exit and the senior assessor's table, which was either confidence or calculation, and Brendan filed the difference away without answering it yet. "You sure you've got the right building?" Knox continued, louder this time, inviting the room. "Career fairs downstairs." Brendan picked up his numbered card from the desk. "I appreciate the concern," he said, and turned toward the waiting line. The quiet that followed was not full silence. It was the smaller, sharper kind, where everyone recalibrated slightly and pretended they hadn't. Above the training floor, behind a glass partition that overlooked the assessment space, a woman stood with a tablet in one hand, and a cold expression that had not shifted since the doors opened. Her name was Cecily Hartwell, daughter of the firm's founder, current managing director, the kind of person whose stillness in a room made other people start talking just to fill it. She had approved one additional slot for this cycle after a recommendation came to her office through an internal routing she had not yet traced. A single note flagged as coming from a prior intake file, requesting that a late applicant named Brendan Solís be granted access to the final assessment position. She had approved it not because she trusted the source, but because she was curious about anyone who applied with a folder that had a three-legged dog drawn on it in purple marker. The first assessment was physical. Knox went early, which was exactly what Brendan expected. Men who needed the room to know what they were capable of went first. The drill was a controlled takedown simulation. An assessor played the role of an approaching threat, and the applicant was evaluated on response time, technique, and control. Knox moved the way trained fighters always moved when they had an audience. Slightly larger than necessary, efficiently showy, fast enough to impress and controlled enough to look like they were holding back. The assessor hit the mat cleanly. Knox stood back with his arms open to the room. Applause from a few people near the wall. Brendan went last. The assessor stepped forward. Brendan recognized the footwork. Former wrestling background, weight distributed for forward drive. When the charge came, Brendan stepped diagonally rather than retreating, used the assessor's momentum against the angle of his own hip, and redirected the force through a wrist rotation that brought the man to the floor in a controlled descent rather than a crash. No impact, no drama. The assessor was already pushing himself upright before the room had finished registering what happened. Silence was different this time. The previous silences had been social. This one was something else. Knox's smile had gone flat, and then every fire alarm in the building went off at once. Not the single tone of a test cycle, the full cascade. Alarm lights, evacuation override, automated voice instructing occupants to proceed to designated exits. Senior assessors reached for radios. Applicants looked at each other. Two men moved immediately toward the stairwell doors. Brendan did not move toward the stairs. He looked up. Then at the eastern corridor camera, which had been panning normally 30 seconds ago and was now fixed, frozen mid-sweep. He looked at the security officer near the north door, who had pressed one finger to his earpiece and whose face had changed from professional calm to the specific blankness that meant he was receiving something he was not yet authorized to repeat out loud. Brendan crossed the room quietly and stood beside him. "What floor?" The officer looked at him. "Sir, I need you to tell me what floor." Brendan's voice did not rise. It simply arrived at the frequency that made people answer before they had decided to. "Because your camera on the eastern corridor hasn't moved in 40 seconds, and that's not a malfunction, that's a loop." "So what floor?" The officer's jaw tightened. Then, unconfirmed report, 17th floor, executive suite. Brendan was already reading the building directory mounted beside the fire panel. Hartwell Consulting's executive administration occupied the 17th floor. One floor below the assessment level where Cecily had been standing at the glass partition. He turned toward the stairwell. "Sir." The officer put an arm out. "Assessment candidates are required to remain in the holding." "The camera loop started before the alarm," Brendan said. "That means the alarm is secondary." Someone triggered evacuation to create movement, not to respond to a fire. He looked at the man steadily. "If you're going to stop me, do it in the next 4 seconds, otherwise let me through." The officer stepped back. Behind him, Knox said something loud about applicants playing hero. Brendan let the door close on whatever came next. The stairwell was quieter than the floor had been, which was wrong. Evacuation routes should be noise, feet, voices, the compressed sound of people moving in the same direction. Instead, 2 floors down, Brendan heard only his own footsteps and, faintly, something that didn't belong. A door closing with the careful precision of someone trying not to be heard. On 16, he found the first sign, a security officer seated against the wall with his legs straight out in front of him and his chin dropped. Not unconscious, not quite, but chemically slowed, the kind of sedation that arrived fast and left no marks on the neck if you knew where to place the delivery point. His radio was gone. His access card was still in his breast pocket, which told Brendan the intruders had either not needed it yet or had a copy already. He took the stairs more carefully after that. 17th floor. The executive administration level opened into a corridor that felt deliberately wrong, too quiet. One overhead light was off. Not blown, deliberately switched. The camera above the main entrance was angled 12 degrees off its correct orientation, precisely enough to leave the corridor junction blind without obviously suggesting tampering to someone reviewing from a central monitor. These were not amateurs. These were people who had studied this building with time and access. The receptionist at the main desk was crouched behind the counter, not hiding in panic, but making herself small with the practiced calculation of someone who had already assessed the situation and made a quiet decision. Brendan approached slowly enough not to startle her. "Where is Miss Hartwell?" he asked softly. She looked up. She had been crying, but her voice was steady. "Two men. They said it was a secured evacuation. They took her toward the West briefing room." She paused. They weren't wearing the right lanyards. Brendan noticed that detail. Not the guns, not the urgency, the lanyards. "How long ago?" 4 minutes. He moved. The West briefing room had glass walls that overlooked a smaller interior corridor. From the corner angle, Brendan could see 2 figures in Hartwell security uniforms standing outside the room's primary entrance. And through the glass, Cecily Hartwell standing with her back to the far wall, arms at her sides, chin elevated, refusing whatever the man in front of her was saying. One of the uniformed figures outside checked his watch. They were waiting for something. Brendan identified 3 problems. 2 men at the door, a third man inside with Cecily, and the probability of at least one more he hadn't seen yet. He identified one advantage. The men outside were watching the main corridor. The service access panel at the end of the East Hall was not within their sight line. He reached the service panel in 12 seconds. It opened into a narrow utilities corridor that ran parallel to the briefing room's interior wall. There was a secondary door at the far end used by cleaning staff that opened inward. He went through it. The man inside the briefing room registered the sound too late. Brendan covered the distance before the reaction completed, controlled the arm that was reaching for a radio, and brought the man down without a collision loud enough to travel through the glass wall. Cecily moved instantly, not toward the door, not screaming, but sideways and low, clearing the center of the room in one clean motion. Sharp instincts, Brendan filed it. He held the man on the floor long enough to pull the radio and earpiece free, then looked at Cecily. "Side door," he said. She looked at him. 19th floor, she said. "You're an applicant." "The far side door," he repeated. "The men outside are waiting for a signal. When it doesn't come in the next 90 seconds, they'll check." She moved. He followed. They reached the service stairwell through a route that bypassed the main corridor entirely, which Cecily navigated without hesitation because Brendan realized she had walked this building in every configuration. She knew it the way people knew things when they had been afraid of something going wrong long enough to memorize the exits. On the landing between 16 and 17, she spoke. "Who told you to come here today?" Brendan looked at the door above them, listening. Anonymous note. "When?" "Tuesday night." Something crossed her face. Not surprise exactly, recalibration. "My father received something similar 8 months ago, before he had his first cardiac event." She paused. "The doctors said stress-induced." Brendan looked at her. "Who benefits if Hartwell Consulting changes leadership?" Cecily was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. 3 senior partners would move to full equity if I were removed from management. Which one scheduled today's assessment trial? Her jaw tightened. That would be Lawrence Croft. The name landed like a stone. They heard footsteps above them then, 2 sets moving fast, descending toward their level. Brendan put his back to the wall and pulled Cecily behind him. The footsteps passed, real security, finally mobilized, heading down rather than up. He let out a careful breath. His phone vibrated against his hip. He ignored it. It vibrated again. He glanced at the screen. Thea's school. He turned the phone face down. "You can answer," Cecily said. "Not yet." They emerged on the 18th floor through a maintenance access point and moved toward the secondary stairwell that connected to the executive boardroom corridor, which was where Cecily said Lawrence Croft would be if he was following his own contingency plan. She said this without drama, the way people said things when they had already been thinking about a particular betrayal long enough to have mapped its geography. The boardroom was glass-walled on 3 sides. Through the exterior panel, Brendan could see 4 people inside. 2 he didn't recognize. One woman who was introduced later as Helen Vasquez, Hartwell's compliance director, and Lawrence Croft himself, standing at the head of the table with a controlled expression that matched the decor. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, the kind of man whose authority arrived before he spoke. He had been with Hartwell Consulting for 19 years. He had helped build the client list. He had, according to Cecily, also been rerouting retainer fees through a subsidiary structure that her father had begun to notice 3 quarters ago, before his health declined and the audit was quietly shelved. Brendan's phone vibrated a 3rd time. He answered it on the 2nd ring, pressing it to his ear with one shoulder while watching the room through the glass. "Mr. Solís, the school secretary." Careful, apologetic tone. "Thea asked me to let you know she's fine, but her emergency authorization code expired at noon. Policy is, I know, tell her I'm coming." An hour, maybe less. A small pause, and then Thea's voice arrived in the background, not loud enough to be on the phone, but perfectly audible, the way 9-year-olds were when they were pretending not to listen. "He sounds like his serious voice," she said. That means something went sideways. Cecily was watching him. He lowered the phone. "She says if I sound like that, something went sideways." Cecily said nothing, but something in the set of her face changed by a small degree. He had not told her about Thea yet. He had not told her about the 3 years of contract work, or the school soccer team, or the fact that he had ironed his jacket that morning because Thea had asked him to look professional, and he had taken it more seriously than he intended to. He had not told her about Isabel, who had left when Thea was 6, or about the years in plainclothes before that, or about the assignment he never discussed where a witness under his protection had not made it to the courthouse because someone on the inside had needed her not to. He had not told her any of it, but the way she was looking at him suggested that she was the kind of person who heard a great deal in what wasn't said. "There are 3 people in that room who may not be there voluntarily," he said, "and Lawrence Croft is the only one standing." Cecily looked through the glass. "Helen Vasquez is my compliance director. She would not be in that room without pressure. Then we go in through the anteroom on the north side." He glanced at her. "Do you know how to stay behind someone?" She gave him a look that was almost dry. "I ran hostile environment briefings for 6 years before I took managing director." "Right." They went in through the anteroom. What happened next took less time than the room seemed built to contain. The first man near the north entrance reacted to the door opening and moved, but Brendan had already mapped his weight distribution from the glass. Front foot heavy, compensating for a right side weakness. He redirected the motion into the wall with one controlled movement that made noise but no damage. The second man came from behind the presentation screen, and Brendan dropped below the line of the swing, came up inside the reach, and put him down cleanly on the boardroom carpet. Lawrence Croft stood very still. Helen Vasquez moved immediately toward the wall, which was the right decision. The 2 unknown men near the windows were not security. They understood this in the moment Croft's face changed, because Croft's face changed before they knew what to do, which meant they were following his lead rather than acting independently. Cecily entered the room behind Brendan and stopped in the doorway. She looked at Lawrence Croft for a long moment in the way that people looked at things they had understood too late to prevent and were now simply committing to memory. "Lawrence," she said. He straightened his lapels. "Cecily, you should have taken the executive extraction path. It was arranged for your safety. The extraction path leads to the South Terrace elevator." She paused. "Where your outside contact has a clear sight line." Croft said nothing. "How long?" she asked. He considered the question as though it deserved honest engagement. "Your father found the transfers in February. He trusted me with the audit file before he trusted anyone else." A pause. That was his error. Brendan had the radio he'd taken from the first man in the briefing room. He handed it to Helen Vasquez and said, "Call your internal security team, not the ones on Croft's rotation." Helen looked at the radio, then at him, then took it and moved toward the corridor. One of the men near the windows made a decision and reached inside his jacket. Brendan covered the distance before the motion completed. He disarmed the man without injury beyond wounded dignity, reversed the grip, and handed the firearm to Cecily, who took it with the specific neutrality of someone who was not comfortable with it, but was refusing to be uncomfortable in front of anyone. The second man did not move. Croft looked at Brendan for the first time with something that might have been genuine evaluation. "You're the late applicant. No resume. I filed in person on Monday," Brendan said. "Someone replaced my intake form." Croft's mouth moved slightly. "Someone ensured you had a reason to be in this building when this happened. I'd like to know who that was as much as you would." Brendan looked at him. "I think you know already." The silence that followed was the kind that came when the truth was in the room, but no one had yet decided who was responsible for saying it out loud. Then Helen returned from the corridor and said that internal security was 2 minutes away, and that someone had triggered an external alert that was already pulling city police to the building's perimeter. And the particular specific way she said it made Brendan think she had been waiting months for something to change and was finally, carefully relieved. Croft's expression closed. He stopped talking. The police arrived in 90 seconds, not 2 minutes, which Brendan appreciated as a professional standard. His phone rang. He answered it in the corridor while 2 officers he'd spoken briefly with were finishing the documentation on the boardroom situation. "Dad." Thea, clear and entirely unbothered in the way she was unbothered by most things that weren't spiders or unfair bedtime rules. "Mrs. Kowalski says I can stay for Clay Club if you're still working." He leaned against the corridor wall. His shoulder ached where it had absorbed contact with the doorframe earlier. He hadn't told anyone. "You've already had lunch?" "Soup." "It was fine." "Not great. Fine is enough." "Did it go okay?" she asked. "The interview thing?" He looked back through the glass at the boardroom, where Lawrence Croft was being escorted toward the east elevator, and Cecily Hartwell was standing at the head of her table with her arms folded, already talking to two people who looked like they had been waiting for the opportunity for some time. Helen Vasquez was beside her with a tablet. Outside the glass, the lake was flat and pale under the October sky, exactly as indifferent as it had been 3 hours ago. "Still working on it," he said. "You sound like you did the hard part already." He almost said something and then didn't. "Go make something with Clay. I'll be there before 4. If you forget," Thea said pleasantly, "I'll tell Mrs. Kowalski your real age." "That's a threat." "That's information," she said, and hung up. He stood in the corridor for a moment longer than he needed to. The building had settled into the particular quiet that came after emergency. Machinery still running, voices lower, the ordinary sounds of the place reasserting themselves over the disruption, as though the building wanted to return to being unremarkable as quickly as possible. The envelope had arrived on a Tuesday. He had nearly left it unopened because Tuesdays were Thea's late swim nights, and by the time they were home and she was showered, and the homework argument was finished, the mail on the counter was background. It was Thea who brought it to him. "It looks important," she'd said. "It has your name in real pen, not printer." He had opened it at the kitchen table after she was asleep, read it twice, and left it there overnight while he thought. He had come because the handwriting on the index card was familiar in a way that didn't fully clarify itself until the next morning. A particular forward slant, slight hesitation before capital letters. Isabel had written like that. He had told himself it was coincidence, told himself that grief made patterns out of noise, told himself he was reading into paper. He still wasn't sure he was wrong. Lawrence Croft's last coherent statement before the officers moved him was aimed at no one in particular. The anonymous note that brought Solís here was filed using an internal intake code that expired 4 years ago. Someone had access to legacy systems. 4 years ago was when Isabel had briefly worked consulting compliance reviews for a firm connected to Hartwell's secondary client structure. Brendan had not known the connection at the time. He knew now that she had flagged something in her review notes, a discrepancy in retainer routing that matched Croft's subsidiary pattern almost exactly. The file had been closed and reclassified. 6 months later, she left. Brendan had always understood it as the work pressure breaking something between them. He understood it differently now. She had tried to send him here. She had known he would eventually need to see what she had found, and she had left a path in the only way she could without involving him before he was ready. He sat with that understanding in the corridor for a little while. Then he stood up because sitting with things was not the same as deciding what to do with them, and deciding what to do with them required the kind of clarity that did not come in corporate corridors. Cecily found him before he reached the elevator. "My security director wants a statement," she said. "And then I have questions." She paused. "Not corporate questions, I know. The note, the intake code, the internal routing, I know," he said again. She looked at him carefully. Cecily Hartwell was 47 years old and had been running a firm built on the premise that she knew how to read rooms, risk, and people. She had been right about Croft eventually. She had been right about several things today. She had also, Brendan suspected, been running the building largely alone for longer than she would have described as sustainable. "I have a daughter at Clay Club who's been at school since 7:30, he said. "I need to be there before 4. Cecily nodded once. "The statement will take 40 minutes, she said. "Then I'll drive you." He looked at her. "You don't need to do that. You went into a briefing room with 2 armed individuals to get me out," she said. "So I'm going to drive you to pick up your daughter from Clay Club." "This is not a negotiation," he conceded the point. The statement took 43 minutes. Cecily's driver was held up by the police perimeter, so she drove herself in a company car that still smelled like new upholstery, moving through the early afternoon Toronto traffic with the specific competence of someone who had a lot of practice going somewhere while thinking about something else entirely. At a red light on King Street, she said, "The woman who filed the intake code, was she someone who knew what she'd found?" "Yes," Brendan said. A pause. "Was she someone who knew you would do something about it if you understood?" The light changed. Yes. Cecily drove. At the school, Thea came out of the side doors, still wearing her clay-stained art smock, carrying a lumpy ceramic shape that might have been a dog, or might have been a conceptual piece. She saw Brendan, looked at his jacket, then looked at the woman standing beside him with what 9-year-olds deployed when they were deciding whether an adult was worth the effort of a full assessment. That's not your car, Thea said. Good observation, Brendan said. Thea looked at Cecily. Did he do okay? Cecily considered the question with exactly the gravity it deserved. He did more than okay. Thea nodded, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. She held out the ceramic shape. It had 3 legs. I made a dog, she said. For your folder. Brendan looked at it. Thea, he said. I didn't have the folder today. I know, she said. I put it in your bag this morning. She shrugged with the breezy accountability of someone who did not plan to apologize. For luck. He looked at his bag. He had not checked the interior pocket. He reached in and found it there. The intake form from the registration desk, retrieved at some point during the assessment, still bearing the 3-legged dog in purple marker in the upper right corner. He had walked into a building full of people measuring him by the wrong instruments, and he had done it carrying this. He folded it carefully and put it back. The drive to his apartment took 20 minutes. Thea fell asleep in the back seat 4 blocks from the school, her head against the window and the ceramic dog held loosely in both hands, the way she slept when she decided the day had given her enough. Cecily said, quietly enough not to wake her, that the formal contract offer would come through official channels, but that she was saying now what the channels would say later, so that he could sleep without the uncertainty. He thanked her without making a production of it. Before she pulled away from the curb, she said, "The woman who left you the note. She knew what she was doing when she sent you in there." Brendan looked at the building entrance, where the light was on in the lobby and the super had propped the door because the buzzer was still broken. She usually did, he said. He carried Thea upstairs without waking her, which was harder than it had been a year ago because she was growing and he was not getting younger. But some things were worth the effort regardless of the calculus. He set her on the couch, with the ceramic dog still in her hand, and sat in the chair across from her in the quiet apartment that smelled like the soup she hadn't finished this morning, and the particular warm smell of a home that was used and comfortable in theirs. He did not think about Lawrence Croft. He did not think about the boardroom glass, or the camera that had been looped, or the man he had put on the briefing room floor without leaving a mark. He thought about a Tuesday evening and an envelope opened too late at a kitchen table, and the handwriting that had leaned forward the way it always had, as though it was trying to get somewhere important before the sentence ended. And he let himself believe, in the specific small way that tired people allowed themselves small things, that she had known exactly where the sentence needed to go,